Hello, I'm Kate Denehy, Director of the Seabrook Writing Center and Tutoring Services and the Bruce Math Center at Columbia College. And today I'm going to talk to you about identifying and correcting sentence fragments and run-ons. So it might not be the most exciting presentation you've ever heard, but it is important because by correcting sentence fragments and run-ons, you'll make your writing more clear and you'll get your ideas across more effectively to your audience. Before we can actually talk about identifying fragments and run-ons and fixing them, we actually have to first be able to identify a clause and really understand what it is. So what actually is a clause? A clause is a group of related words that contains both a subject, which is a person, place, or a thing, and a predicate, which is an assertion about the subject in the form of a finite verb with or without other words and modifiers. And that probably sounds like a lot of mumbo jumbo, but hang with me because I think as we move forward through the presentation, it'll be more clear what I'm talking about. So all of the following are clauses. When I went to the store, they were late for class, if you tell her, the water is frigid. They all have a subject and they all have a predicate. So let's take a look at these and a few others a little bit more closely. So first, let's identify the subjects in each of these clauses. In number 1, when I went to the store, the subject or the person, place, or thing is I. You can see that in red here. In number 2, they were late for class. We have a couple nouns. We have they and late, but the subject that the clause is about is they. In number 3, if you tell her, our subject's you. The water is frigid. The subject is water. The books that were in the pile by the door are missing. We've got books as our subject. After the pundits stopped arguing with one another. So our subject in that clause is pundits. That her friends forgot to pick her up. What's our subject here? Yep, it's friends. Okay, so we've identified the subjects. Let's move on and identify the simple and complete predicates. Now remember, the predicate is the verb part of the clause. So in our first one, when I went to the store, the simple predicate is went, which you can see in purple here, and went is the controlling verb for that clause. Now the complete predicate is simply, you just add the rest of the words that go along with that simple predicate or that controlling verb. So we have went as the simple predicate, went to the store as the full predicate. Number 2, they were late for class. What's our simple predicate or our controlling verb? It's going to be were, and the complete predicate is were late for class because all those words work together as the predicate in the sentence to describe the action for they. I said sentence, but we're still at clauses, right? So number 3, if you tell her, what's the verb here, the main controlling verb? It's tell, and the complete predicate is her. Who are you telling? You're telling her. So that's the predicate for that clause. Number 4, the water is frigid. Is our simple predicate. Is frigid's the complete one. Number 5, the books that were in the pile by the door are missing. So this one's a little trickier. You might think that were is our simple predicate, but you'd actually be wrong there. It's actually are, because the main controlling verb is are, and the complete predicate's missing. So essentially the very core of this clause is the books are missing. The were in the pile by the door, that were in the pile by the door, that phrase is actually just describing the books. It's not actually controlling the action of the clause. And number 6, after the pundits stopped arguing with one another, we've got stopped as our simple predicate and stopped arguing with one another as the complete one. And number 7, that her friends forgot to pick her up, we've got forgot and then forgot to pick her up as our complete predicate. Okay, so now that we've identified simple and complete predicates, let's talk about types of clauses, okay? So you know what a clause is now. It's a group of words. It has a subject and a predicate. But then when we get into clauses, there are different types of clauses. And this is really what you need to know in order to identify and then correct fragments and run-ons. So gotta really pay attention here. So the two types of clauses, the first one is independent. It's also called main clause, and it makes a complete statement and can stand alone as a sentence. A dependent clause, also called a subordinate clause, begins with a subordinating word, and some examples are after, although, because, if, since, when, which, that, who, and there are others. And those subordinating words relate the clause to an independent clause. So essentially, a dependent clause cannot stand alone as a sentence. And you probably see where this is going, that there's a relationship between dependent clauses and sentence fragments. So let's take a look at our previous clauses to see if they're independent or dependent. In our first example here, when I went to the store, notice that we have a subordinating word, when I went to the store. And so for that reason, we know that this has to be a dependent clause. And when you start a sentence with a dependent clause, you're always going to put that comma after the dependent clause before you start that main clause. Now, number two, they were late for class. So there's no subordinating word at the beginning. We just have that subject, they, and we have that verb, and that complete predicate. And so that's going to be an independent clause. In other words, it can stand alone as a complete sentence. Number three, if you tell her. So remember, if is one of those subordinating words. And so it cannot be an independent clause. It can't stand alone as a complete sentence. That makes it a dependent clause. And if you started a sentence with that, you would need a comma right there. Our next one, the water is frigid. So notice there's no subordinating clause at the beginning. And so that's independent, and we're going to put a period there. We've got that subject, water. We've got the complete predicate, is frigid. Boom, you're done. Independent clause, complete sentence. Number five, the books that were in the pile by the door are missing. So what do we think about this one? That's independent. We've got that the subject, we've got a complete predicate. It's all clear. And number six, after the pundits stopped arguing with one another. Now notice we have that subordinating word after at the beginning of that clause. And so that one is dependent. It cannot stand alone. And so notice again, if we started that sentence right there, we would put a comma. Number seven, that her friends forgot to pick her up. Now that is a subordinating word, and for that reason, this is going to be dependent. Now notice that I didn't put a comma here, and that's because it's not likely that you would start a sentence with this clause. You might, but it would probably create a bit of an awkward sentence. It would probably be a clause that would come later in a sentence. So for example, you might say, Sarah was mad that her friends forgot to pick her up. And there you've got an independent clause and complete sentence. But just that clause that begins with that, it cannot stand alone. Okay, so let's move on to our next thing, and we'll talk specifically about sentence fragments. So a sentence fragment is a part of a sentence that's punctuated as if it were a complete sentence. And so fragments tend to occur when a dependent clause is not attached to an independent clause. Remember, we just saw several of those on the previous slide. Or a fragment occurs when a sentence is missing a subject or a complete verb. So remember, when we talked about clauses, in order for a group of words to actually be a clause, they have to have a subject and a complete verb. So some fragments, not only are they not sentences, they're not really even clauses. They're just a phrase. So let's start looking at some examples here and applying what we've learned. So this first example, because the author uses an extended metaphor, it's got a period at the end. It's punctuated like a complete sentence. But what's the actual problem? Because is a subordinating word, and so it signals that the clause is dependent and it can't stand alone as a complete sentence. So how can we fix it? Well, there's always options when you're fixing a sentence. One option is to just remove the word because that makes the sentence is dependent. And then you'd have a complete sentence. So if we take off because, you have the author uses an extended metaphor. We have a subject, author, we have our simple predicate uses, the full predicate and extended metaphor. It's very clear and that works fine. Another option is to connect the fragment to an independent clause. And in a paper that you're revising, that you've written for a class, for example, this often makes the most sense. So look at that fragment and check the sentence before and after in your paper and see if it makes sense connected to one of those. So let's take a look at the example I've given in the middle of other sentences. The author likens the ship to a beast which has swallowed the family because the author uses an extended metaphor. Readers understand the child's fear and feeling of claustrophobia. So that's a little confusing, right? Because we've got that fragment floating between those two complete sentences, and it's very confusing as a reader. So if we think about what we would want to connect that fragment to, think about which sentence it makes the most sense to connect it to. And I think it makes most sense to connect it to the last one. Because the author uses an extended metaphor, readers understand the child's fear and feeling of claustrophobia. So then it's all coming together. It makes a lot more sense. Notice that I started a sentence with because, and that's actually okay as long as you have a comma and the sentence continues with an independent clause that can make it stand alone. Let's take a look at another example. Although most historians agree on the source of the letter. So what's the problem here? Although is a subordinating word, and so it signals that that clause is dependent and can't stand alone as a complete sentence. I see this often in student papers where people use although at the beginning of the sentence, just like they would use however. But as a matter of fact, however and although are not interchangeable. Although always is fully embedded in the clause in which it appears and always creates a dependent clause. So let's think about the best way we can fix this fragment. So one option, kind of like at the previous example, is that we can remove that subordinating word that makes the clause dependent. We can just say, most historians agree on the source of the letter. The problem with this solution sometimes is that it kind of removes nuance from the discussion that that sentence is a part of. So a better solution would be to connect the fragment to an independent clause. Although most historians agree on the source of the letter, interpretations of its content vary widely. And then we can see the context for this statement much more clearly, and it usually flows better in the paper as well. Okay, we have another example of a sentence fragment. The reason that the ship ran off course. So what's wrong with this one? There's not a subordinating word at the beginning to clue us in, right? This example gets a little tricky. So we have a clause with a subject and a verb, but it's not what you might think it is. The clause is that the ship ran off course. We've got the subject of the clause, ship, and we've got a predicate, ran, and we've got the complete predicate with ran off course. But actually, that's not what the sentence is about, right? We've got the main subject is the reason. And so that clause, that the ship ran off course, is actually a dependent clause that describes the reason. And for that reason, it is not a predicate clause. So you see ran, you might be confused and think that's the verb, the controlling verb for the sentence. But it's not, because it's linked to ship, which is not the primary subject of the sentence. Reason is the subject. Therefore, ran is not the predicate verb. Okay, are you still with me? I'm back in the corner. I didn't want to cover up the text on the last slide. So if you're with me on why the reason that the ship ran off course is a fragment, how can we fix it? It's a little more complicated than the other examples. So we need to add a predicate because that's essentially the problem. Remember, we have the subject, reason, and then we have this clause that describes reason, but that's not the predicate. So let's add. Here's an example with the predicate added on. The reason that the ship ran off course was the hurricane strength wind blowing from the southwest. We have this simple predicate in was, and the complete predicate in the hurricane strength wind blowing from the southwest. And notice also it just communicates a much richer, more detailed description of what's happening. Okay, here's a new example, which was the first study to examine the effects of the drug on human subjects. So you'll notice that this kind of sentence might pop up in a biology paper or a psychology paper. And what's the problem with this one? Well, notice we have that subordinating word at the beginning, which. That's our red flag. That tells us that it's dependent and it can't stand alone as a complete sentence. Now, just as a side note, a question can start with which and not be a fragment. But we're not talking about questions right here. We're just talking about statements. And this one definitely is a fragment. So what do we do about it? Well, there's options again. So one option is to change the relative pronoun which to a demonstrative pronoun such as this. Essentially, a clause that starts with which cannot stand alone, but a clause that starts with this can, because this is a subject. So we say, this was the first study to examine the effects of the drug on human subjects. So we have a complete sentence. That's great. But why might it still be a problem in your paper? For a sentence that begins with this to work in your paper, the sentence before it has to be extremely clear regarding what this actually is referring to. So take a look at my example at the bottom. Researchers at the University of Manchester administered albuhaptamin, I made that word up by the way, to 240 men and women over an 8-week period, measuring participants' cortisol levels on a biweekly basis. This was the first study to examine the effects of the drug on human subjects. So notice how very specific that sentence before this is. Now, I have to say that in the majority of papers in which I see a sentence that begins with this or it, that sentence is really not clear enough, and the sentence before doesn't really make it any clearer. So really watch out when you're revising your paper. Look for those places where you've used this or it, and whenever possible, actually replace this or it with the thing you're trying to refer to. Otherwise, make that sentence before much more clear. So here we have a new example. This is our last example for fragments. The deer strolling through the snowy field. So we have a really clear picture of what's being described, right? So what's wrong with it? There's a subject, we have deer, and a predicate, strolling, right? Well, actually, remember in a clause that the predicate has to be a finite verb. And what that means is that the verb has to be able to function alone here. And in fact, strolling is not a finite verb. It can't function as the predicate in a sentence. Strolling is actually what we call a participle. It's the ing form of a verb, and it works as an adjective or part of a verb phrase, but it can't stand alone to make an independent clause. So how can we fix this one? It's a little trickier. Again, we have multiple options. One is to add a helping verb to the participle strolling. So we can say the deer were strolling through the snowy field, and were serves as the helping verb to make a finite predicate in were strolling. But that's not our only option. What's another one? Well, it's possible that you didn't really intend for strolling to be the predicate and you just wanted to describe the deer. In that case, you can add a new predicate to create a more nuanced sentence. So for example, you could say, the deer strolling through the snowy field revealed the depth of the snow that had fallen through the night. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time on clauses and fragments, but hopefully that will have set you up really well to be able to identify and correct run-on sentences a little bit easier. So let's just review for a second our definitions of clauses. An independent clause or a main clause makes a complete statement and can stand alone as a sentence. Remember, a dependent clause can't stand alone as a complete sentence. So a run-on sentence happens when two independent clauses are combined without punctuation or a connecting word between them. If you want to connect two independent clauses, clauses that can stand alone as a complete sentence, you have two choices. First, you can connect them with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. You have to have both. And the coordinating conjunctions are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. If you have a hard time remembering those, you can use the mnemonic device, fanboys, to kind of give you that hint and help you remember what your options are there. The other option is to connect those two independent clauses with a semicolon. So let's take a look at some examples of run-on sentences. The students were late for class, but the instructor didn't penalize them. What's our problem here? Well, we have two independent clauses connected by a conjunction. We've got the students were late for class, and the instructor didn't penalize them, but the sentence is missing the comma, right? So how do we fix it? The solution's actually really simple here. You just add a comma before the conjunction and you no longer have a run-on sentence. So let's look at another example. The water is frigid. The kids don't want to swim. What's wrong with this one? This is actually a special type of run-on that we call a comma splice. So the two independent clauses are separated by a comma, but the coordinating conjunction is missing. So how do we fix that? Again, it's pretty simple. You just pick one of the coordinating conjunctions, remember your fanboys, and put it after the comma. And in this case, I think so makes the most sense. The water is frigid, so the kids don't want to swim. Let's take a look at another example. The books that were in the pile by the door are missing, however, the folders are where I left them. So what's wrong with this one? Well, we have two independent clauses separated by a comma. The books that were in the pile by the door are missing, and however, the folders are where I left them. But however is not a coordinating conjunction, and it cannot be paired with a comma to combine two independent clauses. Now, you might see correct sentences in which however is in the middle of the sentence separated by commas, but in that case, however is being used in a different grammatical way. However is kind of a flexible word in that way. But in this case, it can't function this way. It can't connect two independent clauses. So how can we fix it? This is a perfect situation for a semicolon. You put the semicolon before however, and then you've perfectly connected those two independent clauses. But remember, an independent clause is the clause that can stand alone as a complete sentence. So you can often correct a run-on by separating the clauses rather than connecting them with some special kind of punctuation. Notice in the example, I've just replaced that semicolon with a period and capitalized however, and that's also a perfectly acceptable way to fix that run-on. And the reality is that sometimes a semicolon is really useful, but it's not anything you can't do without a period, really. And so if you go the rest of your life without using a semicolon, odds are you probably will be just fine. So if you're here still, you've made it. You've spent more than 20 minutes of your life learning how to identify and correct fragments and run-ons. And you may be asking yourself, oh my gosh, does it even matter? And really it does. And I'll tell you why. The most important reason to be able to identify fragments and run-ons in your writing and fix them is that when your writing is free of fragments and run-ons, your ideas are communicated so much more clearly to your audience. And that's really our goal anytime we're doing any kind of writing. In addition to that, avoiding fragments and run-ons shows your audience that you care about the quality of your work. And this is true whether you're writing a paper for a class, whether it's a cover letter for a job you really want, whether you're sending an email to a boss or a colleague. And there's so many other situations in which you really communicate respect by making sure that your writing is as clear and neat and clean as possible. Now, I do want to talk about an exception or two that you've probably seen. You've probably noticed fragments and run-ons in poetry and fiction, and you've probably seen fragments in advertising as well. And the reality is that, grammar rules can be broken, and rules exist in certain contexts and not others. And so it's perfectly acceptable in different contexts to actually employ fragments and run-ons on purpose. We do that sometimes in creative writing and advertising to manipulate the audience's emotion, to have a certain impact on the audience. But nevertheless, you still have to know those rules in order to break them thoughtfully and effectively. Are you still confused? You might be, and that's totally understandable. Grammar is not as clear-cut as you might think it would be. And like I said, it's complicated and sometimes situational. So we are always happy to help you in the Writing Center. You can visit our website. I've got it in bold right here, ccis.edu/writing center for helpful resources on grammar and other issues you might be having with writing. And you can also find out how you can schedule an appointment for one-on-one help with one of the consultants in the Writing Center. Thank you so much for hanging with me through what I'm sure was not the most exciting workshop you've attended, but I still think it's really useful. Thanks so much for your time and best wishes.